All right. Hey, everyone. Ready to dive into some serious global issues today. We're going to be tackling poverty and development. All those factors that shape the lives of millions around the world.
It's a huge topic, definitely complex, and there's a lot to unpack.
Exactly. We've got a ton of reports and analyses to sift through, but don't worry, we're here to break it all down, make it clear and understandable.
And hopefully, even a little bit engaging, we'll be looking at the World Bank, debt relief programs, the whole fair trade versus free trade debate.
Oh, and those UPSC aspirants out there, listen closely. This stuff is gold for your international relations paper. But honestly, this is crucial for anyone who wants to be a globally aware citizen, exams or not.
Couldn't agree more. So first things first, let's talk about the World Bank.
Yeah, the big guy, the one everyone's heard of. But do we really understand what it does or the power it holds?
It's definitely an institution with a lot of influence. What's interesting is how its role has shifted over time. Did you know? It was actually born out of the ashes of World War II.
Seriously?
Yeah. Its main focus back then was rebuilding Europe. In fact, their very first loan was a whopping $250 million to France to help them get back on their feet after the war.
Wow, 250 million. Back then, that must have been, I can't even imagine.
It was a huge sum, a sign of the times, I suppose. But from rebuilding Europe, the focus eventually shifted to tackling poverty in developing nations.
So like two completely different missions almost.
In a way, yeah. And that shift brought its own set of complexities and, honestly, controversies. Think back to the 80s, those structural adjustment programs, the SAPs.
Oh, right. I've read about those. Weren't they kind of controversial?
To put it mildly, they basically pushed countries to liberalize their markets, often with some pretty tough conditions attached to the loans they received.
It was like, we'll help you, but only if you do things our way.
Pretty much. And while the results were mixed, some countries saw economic growth, others, though, experienced more poverty, social unrest. It caused a lot of backlash.
Against those SAPs.
Against the whole Washington consensus, the dominant economic ideology of the time, the idea that there's this one-size-fits-all solution for development.
And did the World Bank ever, acknowledge this, that maybe they needed to change their approach?
They did eventually start emphasizing things like good governance and human development, more nuanced stuff. But some critics argue that the fundamental power structures within the World Bank haven't changed much. Voting power, still determined by how much money a country contributes.
Ah, so those with the deepest pockets still call the shots. Makes you wonder who's really setting the agenda for development.
Right, and it's a point we're thinking about. The World Bank, it's not just about economics. There's a definite political dimension, too. And it affects us all, globally.
So we've got this powerful institution, right? The World Bank, shaping global development. But then, on top of that, you've got this whole other issue. Debt. Countries drowning in debt. Can't even provide basic services to their people.
It was a defining crisis, for sure. The debt crisis of the 70s and 80s, a turning point. It really forced the world to confront the inequalities in the global financial system.
I mean, just imagine being a country so burdened by debt that you can't even, invest in healthcare or education.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a few isolated cases. Take Zimbabwe, for instance, their debt skyrocketed from just over $800 million in 1970 to nearly $7 billion by 1990.
Whoa. That's insane. No wonder there were calls for debt relief, to give these countries some breathing room, right?
Absolutely. The movement for debt relief really gained momentum during that period, but it wasn't without its critics.
Really? People were against helping these countries escape crippling debt?
Well, there were concerns. Some argued that it would create a moral hazard, like encourage countries to borrow recklessly in the future if they knew they'd get a bailout.
Ah, so the tough love approach, let them learn from their mistakes kind of thing.
Yeah, there was that line of thinking. And others worried about the impact on the global financial system. Like, would it destabilize things if we just started wiping out debts?
So there's a bit of a balancing act, trying to help those in need without creating bigger problems down the line.
It was, and honestly, it's still a debate that continues today. There's
Yeah.
no easy answer. But out of this crisis, some interesting initiatives emerged. Remember the Brady Bonds program back in '89?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
It helped restructure Latin America's debt, a step in the right direction. But the real game changer came a few years later in '96. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPC.
Oh, yeah, HIPC. I came across that during my UPSC prep. Wasn't that all about, providing debt relief to the world's poorest countries.
Exactly. A joint effort between the World Bank, the IMF, and donor countries to basically give these struggling nations a chance to get back on their feet. And, it actually had some real success stories. Uganda, for example, benefited hugely from HIPC debt relief, freed up resources, invested in education, healthcare, made a tangible difference.
That's incredible. Proof that these programs can work. But I'm guessing it's not all rosy, right? There must be some drawbacks, too.
Of course, nothing's perfect. One of the main criticisms was that the money for debt relief often came straight from aid budgets.
Wait, so they were taking money meant for aid and using it to pay off debts?
In essence, yeah. Which raised concerns about whether this debt relief was actually new assistance or just a reshuffling of existing funds.
So not necessarily a net gain for these countries in the long run.
That's the debate, right? Plus, there were those who argued that the conditions attached to debt relief often pushed a very specific economic ideology, which could limit the policy options for developing nations.
So we're back to the issue of who's really in control. Who gets to decide how development happens? It all feels very interconnected. The World Bank, debt relief. And now let's throw another hot topic into the mix. Fair trade versus free trade.
Right, a classic debate, and one that gets to the core of how we think about global justice. Is free trade really fair when developing countries are often starting from a position of disadvantage?
Yeah, it's like if the playing field's already tilted, can we really expect everyone to compete equally?
That's a key question. Free trade, in theory, is all about removing barriers. Tariffs, quotas, anything that restricts the flow of goods and services. Sounds good, right?
Yeah, on paper, it's like, let's all trade freely, everyone benefits. But I'm sensing a but coming.
But critics argue that pure free trade, especially without proper regulations, can actually widen the gap between rich and poor countries.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a developing country is mostly exporting raw materials like coffee beans or cocoa and competing with huge industrialized producers, they're often forced to lower their prices just to stay in the game.
So they're stuck in this race to the bottom. No matter how hard they work, they can't get ahead.
It can feel that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where the idea of fair trade comes in. It's about ensuring that producers, especially small-scale farmers and artisans, get a decent price for their goods. A price that allows them to invest in their communities, improve their livelihoods, and break free from the cycle of poverty.
It's about giving them a fair shot, right? Not just leaving them at the mercy of global market forces. And I've definitely seen more fair trade labels popping up on products these days. Is that consumer awareness making a real difference?
It's a positive sign, for sure. Consumers are becoming more conscious of where their products come from and the impact of their choices. But let's be realistic. Consumer power alone can't fix the systemic inequalities in global trade.
So what's the solution? Do we need like a complete overhaul of the system?
Well,
Because that sounds like a pretty daunting task.
it is a huge challenge, no doubt, but there are things we can do. Strengthening international organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, for example, they have the power to set rules that create a more level playing field. But do they have the political will? That's the question.
Yeah, good question. But it brings us back to that idea we talked about earlier, right? The interplay of politics and economics. It's never just one or the other.
Absolutely. And to really understand how this all works, it's helpful to zoom in on specific moments in history. Moments where these forces converged, clashed, and ultimately shaped the world we live in today. And one such moment was 2005, the year that was dubbed the Year of Africa.
Oh yeah, 2005, I remember that. The G8 summit at Glen Eagles. Bono and Bob Geldof, the Make Poverty History campaign, it was everywhere. Everyone was wearing those white wristbands.
Right. And there was this feeling that finally the world was paying attention to Africa, that maybe, just maybe, real change was on the horizon.
There was a lot of hope riding on that year, wasn't there? What actually happened?
Well, the G8 leaders, they made some big promises, doubling aid to Africa, canceling billions in debt, pushing for fairer trade rules. It felt like a turning point.
It did, like a real victory for those who have been fighting for a more just world. But I'm guessing it wasn't as simple as that.
Of course not. It's international relations, remember. Nothing's ever black and white. While there were some achievements, especially with debt relief, a lot of those Glen Eagles promises, well, they fell short.
In what way? What were the criticisms?
Well, for starters, some of that promised aid increase. Just repackaged versions of existing commitments, not new money at all.
So it was more about making it look good than actually making a difference.
You could say that. And even the doubled aid figures, they were still way below what experts said was needed to actually meet those Millennium Development Goals. Remember those? To end extreme poverty by 2015, a lofty goal.
Yeah, those goals.
Mhm.
Ambitious, to say the least. So the reality didn't quite match the rhetoric.
That's a good way to put it. And then, even with the debt cancellation, there were worries that a lot of African countries were still stuck in this cycle of dependency, reliant on aid instead of building up their own sustainable economies.
So not really addressing the root causes of poverty.
Right. And the push for trade reform, while well-intentioned, ran into a wall of resistance from wealthy nations. Not surprisingly, they weren't so keen on dismantling policies that protected their own industries, even if it meant a less fair deal for developing countries.
It's like the self-interest of powerful nations always seems to trump the needs of the developing world.
It's a recurring theme, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss the significance of 2005 entirely. It did galvanize global attention on Africa. It did lead to some progress, even if it fell short of the hype.
It's a reminder that change is slow.
Right.
It happens in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we have to keep pushing for it, keep the pressure on.
Absolutely. And that's where informed citizens, like those of you listening to this deep dive, play a crucial role. The more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to demand better solutions, to hold our leaders accountable.
It's about seeing through the spin, right? Analyzing policies, engaging in meaningful debate, being active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
Exactly. And it's about asking the big questions like, what does the future of development even look like? Because the world is changing fast. We're facing challenges we've never seen before. Climate change, pandemics, rising inequality. The old ways of doing things might not cut it anymore.
You're right. It's like we can't just keep slapping Band-Aids on the problem. We need some fresh thinking, some bold new approaches.
Absolutely. And thankfully, the conversation is shifting. There's a growing awareness that development can't just be about economic growth. It has to be about social inclusion, environmental sustainability, empowering local communities.
It's about creating societies that thrive, not just economies that grow, right?
Exactly. And the exciting thing is, it's not just the traditional power players driving this shift. We're seeing new voices emerge. Emerging economies like China and India are stepping onto the global stage, offering alternative models for development, different ways of thinking about aid and cooperation.
So it's like a challenge to that old North-South dynamic,
Yeah.
where the global North was always seen as the one calling the shots.
It is, and it's creating both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it could lead to more diverse development approaches, more tailored to local needs, less reliant on those old aid structures.
Sounds promising.
Mhm.
But I'm guessing it's not all smooth sailing.
Of course not. There are always questions to be asked about transparency, accountability, whether these new investments come with their own set of strings attached.
It feels like we're entering a new era of development, right? More complex, more multipolar, more uncertain.
It is. And for those of you preparing for the UPSC, this is all crucial stuff. The world is in constant flux, and you need to understand these evolving dynamics.
It's not just about memorizing facts for an exam, right?
Yeah.
It's about developing the critical thinking skills to navigate a rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. The world isn't standing still, and neither should our understanding of it.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The World Bank, debt relief, fair trade. It's a lot to digest.
It is. And it's all connected, right? All part of this big, complicated system we call global development.
Exactly. And to wrap things up, let's revisit that pivotal year we talked about earlier, 2005, the year of Africa. Remember all the buzz, the G8 summit, the massive campaigns, those white make poverty history wristbands everyone was wearing. It felt like the world was finally paying attention to Africa.
It did, didn't it? There was this sense of hope, a belief that maybe this time things would be different.
The G8 leaders, they made some pretty big promises. Doubling aid to Africa, canceling billions in debt, pushing for fairer trade rules. It seemed like a turning point, a real win for those who had been advocating for change.
It did seem that way at the time, but as we've seen, things are rarely that straightforward.
Yeah, the reality on the ground often tells a different story. So what actually happened? Did those Gleneagles promises deliver?
Well, there were definitely some positive outcomes. Debt relief, in particular, saw some significant progress, but a lot of those commitments, they fell short of expectations.
How so? What went wrong?
For one thing, a chunk of that promised aid increase turned out to be just repackaged versions of existing commitments, not new money at all.
So more like creative accounting than actual generosity.
You could say that. And even the double aid figures, well, they were still way below what experts said was needed to actually achieve those Millennium Development Goals. Remember those ambitious targets to eradicate poverty by 2015?
Yeah, those goals were, well, ambitious is an understatement.
Exactly. And then on top of that, even with the debt cancellation, there was this concern that many African countries were still stuck in a cycle of dependency, reliant on aid instead of being able to build their own sustainable economies.
So not really getting at the root of the problem.
Right. And the push for trade reform. Well-intentioned, but it faced a lot of resistance from wealthy nations. Not surprisingly, they weren't too keen on giving up protectionist policies that benefited their own industries, even if it meant a less fair deal for developing countries.
So we're back to that theme of self-interest, the powerful looking out for themselves.
It's a pattern we see time and time again, unfortunately.
It's frustrating, but it's also a reality check. It reminds us that change is hard, it's messy, it's often incremental.
It is. But that doesn't mean we should give up hope. 2005 showed us that progress is possible, that raising awareness, mobilizing people, putting pressure on leaders, it can make a difference.
It's about staying engaged, right? Staying informed, holding those in power accountable for their promises.
Exactly, and that's what we've tried to do with this deep dive. Equip you with the knowledge and understanding to see through the spin, to analyze the complexities, to think critically about these crucial global issues.
Because ultimately, it's about more than just passing an exam, right? It's about being informed citizens, about contributing to a more just and equitable world.
Well said.
So to all our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions, keep pushing for change, keep diving deep. And don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations into these fascinating and crucial topics. Until next time.